A Boeing 737 carrying 132 passengers climbs out of control just moments before landing. The pilots try desperately to push the nose down, but their aircraft is hellbent on going up. As it does, its speed drops and the pilot's stick shakers vibrate loudly, indicating that they're about to stall and fall from the sky. The terrified passengers hold on for dear life as the engines roar and the aircraft shudders. Will the pilots be able to wrestle their aircraft back under control, or will a simple misunderstanding spell their doom? This is the story of Thomson Fly 3894. On the night of September 23rd, 2007, 132 passengers and 5 crew boarded a Thomson Fly Boeing 737 at Faro in the south of Portugal. Most of the passengers were returning from their late summer holidays in the Iberian Peninsula to a cold and blustery United Kingdom. Flight 3894 would take them to Bournemouth on the south coast of England. The flight time was 2.5 hours. As the passengers boarded, the pilots were busy preparing the aircraft for departure. The plane they were flying was a 12-year-old Boeing 737-300. The 300 variant was an older version of the 737s produced today, hence the mishmash of CRT displays and analog dials you can see here in the cockpit. But despite not having the bells and whistles of a modern 737, it was still a safe and serviceable short-haul jet. However, given recent events with Boeing's 737 MAX, you couldn't be blamed for thinking that newer isn't necessarily a good thing. That is, unless you're talking about the new web browser from Opera. Unlike the 737 MAX, Opera's new web browser is a complete refresh of the old design, which unlocks the full potential of what the internet is today. I love the sleek modern interface with all of the apps I use within reach on this sidebar, so they're easy to find no matter how many tabs I have open. Say I'm working away on one of these videos and I get a message on Facebook. I can just click on the messenger icon on the sidebar here and reply straight away. In the same way, if I want to post something on Instagram, I can just click the Insta icon here and fire away. I mean, look at this quality content. My favourite feature though has to be the tab islands. See this clean looking tab section at the top? What if I told you that behind this orange bar were actually all of the tabs I put in this tab island, which I'll call the video tab island. And behind this one is my general searches, in this case, holidays. Behind this one, there's stuff to do with Green Dot Aviation. I can expand and contract these tab islands just as I want, which makes it so much easier to stay organised and productive. I also really like having a built-in VPN and ad blocker, which I can turn on with a single click. Opera even has its own AI, Aria, embedded into the browser. I find this really useful because whenever I have a question which Google can't answer, I just ask Aria. Opera really feels like the future of the web. Everything I need is just there in the browser itself. Click my link in the video description to download Opera. It's free, it's fast, and it just works. Now, let's get back to the video. Once the bags were loaded and the passengers had boarded, the flight attendants closed the doors and Flight 3894 was pushed back from the gate. The pilots started the 2 engines and began their taxi out to the runway, completing their checklists as they went. In command on this night was a 56-year-old captain. He had been with the company for 18 years and had built up over 11,000 hours of flying experience in his time as a pilot. However, most of this time was spent on the Boeing 757 and 767. He was still very new to the 737, having just been promoted to captain on it the previous year. At this point, he had just over 400 hours on the aircraft. Sitting to his right was a 30-year-old first officer. He too was relatively new to the 737, and to jets in general. He had just over 800 hours on the 737. Previously, he had flown the turboprop-driven Dash 8, on which he had built up the majority of his over 3,000 flying hours. On this night, the first officer would be flying the aircraft, while the captain acted as pilot monitoring. At about 9:30 local time, the first officer lined the aircraft up on the runway and powered up the engines for takeoff. Moments later, the plane was climbing skywards. The pilots raised the flaps and gear and turned north towards the UK. It was a calm night in Faro, but 1,000 miles to the north, in Bournemouth, conditions were not so clement. It was somewhat windy there, but the main problem was the cloud base. The pilots would not be able to see the runway until they were just 400 feet from the ground, about 30 seconds before touchdown. This was well within safe limits, but just in case, the captain had decided to take on additional fuel at Faro, giving him the chance to carry out 2 approaches to land in case his first one wasn't successful. All was routine as the plane climbed to its cruising altitude and set off north over Spain. It was approaching 11 PM as Flight 3894 flew through the clear night sky high over the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Jersey. The captain had used the last few minutes of the relative calm of the cruise to get the latest weather broadcast for Bournemouth. The first officer would be landing the aircraft on this evening, and as part of the descent preparation, he would soon begin to brief the captain on the approach and landing. Behind the cockpit door, a serene atmosphere had enveloped the cabin. Some passengers idly chatted, while others quietly read, bathed in the dim glow of the overhead lights. The hum of the two engines had lulled many others to sleep. 3 cabin crew members were finishing the in-flight service and were awaiting the sound of the seatbelt sign being switched on. This was the signal from the cockpit that the 737 would now be commencing its descent into Bournemouth. The latest weather confirmed that the crew's earlier decision to take on extra fuel before they departed Faro was a wise one. Conditions at the airport that evening were less than ideal. The low cloud base meant that the pilots would have to rely solely on their instruments until the aircraft broke through the cloud at 400 feet. However, this was well above the minimum required for a well-equipped airliner like the 737. During his approach briefing, the first officer informed the captain that he was going to use the maximum amount of flap for landing, 40 degrees. This was an unusual decision. There were only 2 destinations where full flap was needed. Bournemouth was neither of them. Full flap is only used when the landing runway is short. The 40 degrees of flap would increase the amount of drag by a significant amount. Along with the extra drag, however, it would also increase the amount of lift that the wings produced. That has the benefit of allowing a slightly reduced final approach and landing speed. The combined effect of this is a shorter landing run. Due to the low cloud base, the first officer also briefed that the approach would be an instrument approach, using the runway's ILS, or Instrument Landing System. This gives the pilots both vertical and horizontal guidance all the way down to the runway, allowing them to land in very low visibility. Then, the pilots calculated the final approach speed, based on the aircraft's weight. On this night, they would fly the final approach at 135 knots. This was fast enough to be safely above the stall speed, but slow enough that they would not use up too much runway on landing. Everything ready, Flight 3894 now began its descent towards Bournemouth. It was a quiet night at the airport. To save the pilots time and fuel, air traffic control cleared them to make their own way to the ILS for runway 26. The first officer descended and slowed the plane down, turning it directly towards the extended centerline of runway 26. Within a few minutes, he had positioned the aircraft 11 nautical miles, or about 20 kilometers from the runway. The plane was level at 2,500 feet, and it had slowed down to 180 knots. The first stage of flap had also been extended. So far, this approach was no different than the thousands of others this experienced crew had flown. To ease the pilot's workload, like most modern aircraft, the Boeing 737-300 has an auto-throttle system. Its role is to automatically provide the right amount of thrust at any stage of the flight. It also has several modes, which allow the pilots to set takeoff power, climb power, and approach power, all far more accurately than the pilots could do by moving the throttles themselves. At this point, the autothrottle was engaged in speed mode. This meant that whatever speed the pilots had set on the mode control panel here, the autothrottle would move the 2 engine levers to maintain that speed. These may seem like mere details, but they are details which will play a crucial role in what is about to happen. At 7 nautical miles from the runway, about 13 kilometers, Flight 3894 intercepted the glide slope for runway 26. The glide slope is the vertical component of the instrument landing system, which guides the plane down towards the runway. In order to descend, the autothrottle reduced power on the engines, and the plane now began to follow the glide slope down towards the runway at a 3-degree angle. The first officer called for the landing gear to be lowered and for flap 15 to be selected. At this point, the pilots were still very much in IMC, or Instrument Meteorological Conditions. The flight would remain in the clouds until the final moments before touchdown. As far as the 132 passengers were concerned, they were just a few minutes away from disembarking the aircraft, collecting their bags, and going home. But what happened next would put everyone on board in grave danger. As the aircraft descended, the first officer selected a lower speed on the autopilot. The thrust levers moved all the way back to idle to allow the plane to slow to this new speed. But just 20 seconds later, something strange happened. The autothrottle quietly disconnected. The green autothrottle light extinguished and a flashing red light illuminated in order to alert the pilots that the autothrottle had disengaged. But neither pilot noticed. There is no sound when the autothrottle disconnects, only this visual warning. The plane continued its descent, as the pilots were blissfully unaware that the picture they had in their head of what the aircraft was doing was very different from what was actually happening. Because the plane had already been on idle thrust when the autothrottle disconnected, nothing about the plane's flight path changed when this happened. The aircraft simply continued descending and decelerating as normal. The autopilot, which is separate from the autothrottle, continued to fly the plane, controlling the pitch and roll in order to keep it perfectly on the ILS. As the speed slowed past 150 knots, the first officer called for 25 degrees of flap. But this is where the next critical chain in this unfortunate series of events occurred. As planes slow down, their wings generate less lift being the force that keeps them in the air. To prevent this, the autopilot, or the pilot, whoever is flying, moves the horizontal stabilizer on the tailplane in order to pitch the plane up. This greater angle of attack, that is, the angle the wing makes with the oncoming air, increases the amount of lift that the wing generates, so that it can still stay in the air even at lower speeds. This movement of the horizontal stabilizer is called trimming. When the autopilot flies the aircraft, the autopilot trims the aircraft. When the pilots fly the aircraft, they trim the aircraft, generally by using these small switches on the control columns here. So, as Flight 3894 slowed down towards its final approach speed, the autopilot gradually brought the nose of the aircraft up so that it would still produce the lift it needed to keep it descending at the target rate. So far, apart from the rather important fact that the pilots hadn't noticed the autothrottle disconnecting, everything appeared in order. As the plane slowed, the pilots continued extending the flaps. Each flap setting has a recommended airspeed at which it should be deployed. As the pilots weren't used to landing with the full 40 degrees of flaps, the first officer needed a quick reminder of the speed at which flaps 40 could be selected. These speeds are printed on the front of the pilot's control columns. The first officer turned up the light on his control column and read the placarded speed. Once the aircraft had passed below this speed, he called for flaps 40, and the captain moved the lever to that position. When this was done, the first officer selected the final approach speed of 135 knots on the autopilot. What he didn't know, of course, was that this speed selection did nothing. The autothrottle was no longer controlling the aircraft's speed. The throttle levers were still in the idle position, right where they had been when the autothrottle disconnected. They would remain there until either the pilots moved them, or until the pilots switched the autothrottle back on. In an aircraft, speed is everything. Planes stay in the air because they move through it fast enough that the air feels thick to the wing, so thick that it can support the weight of the entire aircraft. Without speed, air is simply air, and it cannot support the plane's weight. Slowly but surely, the plane slowed down. Except, with no autothrottle, it didn't stop at 135 knots. Instead, it kept on slowing. The captain watched as the flaps extended to 40 degrees. Once they were there, the landing checklist was complete. By now, the speed of the aircraft had reduced to 130 knots. A few seconds later, after stowing the checklist on top of the instrument panel, the captain saw that the airspeed had now decayed to 125 knots. This was 10 knots lower than they should have been, and it was getting dangerously close to the stall speed. "Speed," the captain barked. The first officer responded by making a small forward movement of the throttle levers, but it was too little and too late. The captain took over. He immediately slammed the thrust levers fully forward and made the standard call out of "Go around, flap 15, check thrust." It might be counterintuitive given how slow the plane had gotten, but the captain's instinctive decision to apply maximum thrust had actually been warned against by Boeing. We'll see why in a moment. Before the engines could spool up, the pilot's stick shakers shook violently, indicating that the aircraft was about to stall. The air was now approaching the wing from such an angle that it could no longer flow smoothly over the top surface. The plane's speed was now a dangerously slow 110 knots, and it continued to decrease. At their current altitude of just 1,500 feet, a stall could easily be fatal. As the engine slowly spooled up to full power, the captain did the only thing he could to prevent a stall. He pushed the control column forwards to keep the nose low. After a few moments, the engines had spooled up to over 80% of their maximum power. During a go-around in a jet like the 737, the increase in thrust from the low-hanging engines causes the plane to pitch up. That's because the plane rotates around its center of gravity, which is located above the engines. By increasing the thrust coming out from the engines, the plane naturally wants to swing up. For this reason, Boeing's flight crew training manual for the 737 warns against applying maximum power during a go-round at low speed. Boeing knew that pilots might instinctively do this if their speed had gotten too low, and they knew that it would lead to a situation where controlling the aircraft's pitch became very difficult. The pilots were now about to experience firsthand why this warning had been issued. As the engines reached the maximum power selected by the captain, the autopilot disconnected, and the pitch, now unshackled from the constraints of the autopilot, started to increase. The captain desperately tried to arrest this pitch up by pushing his control column all the way forwards. But this wasn't enough. All he could move with his control column were these tabs here, the elevators at the back of the horizontal stabilizer. The pitch down force they provided was simply not enough to counteract the massive pitch up generated by the thrust from the engines and the nose-high trim position which the autopilot had set previously. As the plane climbed, its speed decayed rapidly. The stick shaker activated again, indicating that the plane was perilously close to stalling. This was now a life-and-death situation. In the cabin, the terrified passengers couldn't even see what was happening out their windows. They were simply pushed into their seats as the engines roared and the plane shook violently. But then for a moment, the plane began to stabilize. It appeared as if the captain's action of pushing the control column fully forward had slowed the plane's swing upwards. The stick shaker stopped, and the plane's airspeed began to build. Now that they were flying fast enough for it to be safe, the first officer moved the flaps to the 15-degree position. However, the pilots were far from out of the woods yet. The plane was still pitched up at more than 20 degrees. The captain was holding his control column fully forwards, something that is basically never done, just in order to keep the plane from pointing up further. If anything changed, he would have no control over the aircraft's pitch. So, a few moments later, as the flaps retracted on the way up to 15 degrees, the aircraft began to pitch up at an even greater rate than before. In the stress of the moment, one of the pilots began unwittingly pushing the left rudder pedal. Now, the aircraft was not only pitching up, but it was beginning to roll to the left. As the flaps continued to retract, the pitch increased even further. The stick shaker now rattled the pilot's controls for a third time. What more could the captain do? The engines were now providing more than enough thrust for the go-round, but the speed had gotten critically low because of the plane's extremely high pitch. The captain was already applying full nose-down elevator, and yet the aircraft continued to pitch even higher. The first officer called high pitch. The captain responded, saying that he was already pushing fully forwards on his control column. The first officer instinctively joined the captain on the controls, holding his control column at its forward stop. Both men pushed with all of their might, desperate to drop the nose and prevent a stall. But it made no difference. The elevators simply couldn't overcome the combined effects of the stabilizer trying to bring the nose up and the engines swinging the plane up around its center of gravity. The plane was now barely 2,000 feet above the ground. The aircraft continued its insane trajectory, pitching up to over 36 degrees, something that would never happen under normal circumstances. The speed had dropped to just 107 knots, and the pilot's unintentional rudder input had brought the aircraft's bank all the way to 22 degrees to the left. If this roll continued, the plane would soon tip over and nosedive towards the ground. Quickly, the captain pressed the right rudder sharply and leveled the wings. But the terrifying roller coaster ride continued. The aircraft continued pitching up until it reached 44 degrees, all as the pilots held their controls fully forwards and the stick shakers vibrated. But then, the inevitable happened. Barely hanging on, at just 2,500 feet, the 737 stalled. The nose dropped immediately. However, this was not enough to restore a smooth airflow over the wings. In fact, the angle of attack, that is, the angle that the oncoming air makes with the wings, only increased. The plane was now falling at such a rate that the air was coming from beneath it, rather than from in front. As a result of this, its airspeed continued to decrease to just 82 knots, unthinkably slow for a 737. But the nose continued to drop. Over the next 10 seconds, as the pitch reduced towards 20 degrees, the airspeed began to rise. The captain then did something highly counterintuitive, which he had learned in his training. He knew that a big part of the reason the plane had pitched up so much was that the engines were on high power. In order to stop this, he needed to reduce the thrust. It's not the easiest thing to do when you're already dangerously slow, but it was the only way to regain control of the plane at this critical moment. The captain brought the throttle levers back to 86%. The effect this had was immediate. The plane's nose dropped 15 degrees in just 2 seconds. Finally, the stall was over, and on this new lower power setting, the elevators had regained their effectiveness. Cautiously, the captain let the plane's airspeed build, as he held the nose at 5 degrees pitch up. Shaken, the pilots raised the flaps in the gear and climbed to 4,000 feet. The first officer notified air traffic control of the go-round, and the captain brought the plane back around for another approach. As it turned out, the extra fuel that the captain had taken on at Faro had ended up being very useful, but just not for the reason that he'd anticipated. As the crew set themselves up for another approach, the first officer remarked to the captain that during the first approach, the autothrottle hadn't captured the speed it had been set to. What he didn't know was that it was worse than that. It wasn't that the autothrottle had just failed to capture the selected speed, rather, it had actually disconnected. Surprisingly, this wasn't exactly an uncommon event. On this particular aircraft, the autothrottle disconnected by itself on 1 out of every 200 flights. This was a problem not just on this particular aircraft, but on this generation of 737s more generally. On this night, the disconnection just happened to occur at one of the most critical parts of the flight, the final approach. For this reason, serious questions were raised in the subsequent investigation about why the autothrottle disconnect warning had not been noticed by the pilots. Was the small visual indication enough to alert the crew during this high workload phase of flight? The final report into this incident recommended that Boeing and the Federal Aviation Administration conduct a study on the efficacy of the Boeing 737-300, 400 and 500 autothrottle warning system, and take any steps needed to improve crew alerting. Thanks to this, on modern 737s like the 737NG and 737 MAX, it's much more clear to the pilots when the autothrottle is disconnected. And, just as importantly, the autothrottles themselves are a lot more reliable. But ultimately, it is the pilot's responsibility to monitor the plane's flight path and to catch any malfunctions that occur. In this case, the crew failed to notice the speed dropping below the 135 knots they had selected. This led to the captain carrying out an extreme maneuver, which ultimately resulted in a stall close to the ground. But in a curious twist, while the captain's application of full thrust was against Boeing's recommendation, it was not against the training he received from his airline. Thomson Fly's Quick Reference Handbook and Crew Operations Manual did not advise against using full thrust, nor did they advise that the pilots might need to use trim to control the aircraft's pitch during a go-round. This was a significant difference from Boeing's own guidance, and ultimately it led to a near-fatal accident. At 1 minute past 11 that night, Flight 3894 finally touched down at Bournemouth. Both passengers and pilots were shaken, but only the pilots were aware of how close they had truly come to disaster. This serious incident received little coverage in the press, but important changes resulted from it, both in terms of flight crew training and in terms of the reliability of warning systems. It is one of a number of similar incidents which have pushed aviation as a whole to be as safe as it is today.